Good morning, 7 East! Happy Wednesday, everybody. Middle of the week show for you, and I promise it will be much shorter than yesterday's, which was a throwback to those first three I did where they were extra long. That is because we had a lot of content to go through, but not so much today. So, let's get right into it. We're on the air. And let's look at our agenda for today. 3 items on it. First, political parties. Second item in our agenda, the Adams administration. This is the assignment that you may have already started. And then 3, our fun segment of the day, criminal animals, because the crime never stops, and now that humans are pretty much indoors most of the time, the criminal stuff is up to the animals. So, big question for today. What were the first political parties in the United States, and what did they believe in? So, the best way to answer this question is to actually look at George Washington's cabinet, the group of advisors that were around the president, and they had a lot of different views about a lot of different topics, and they did not get along very much. Alexander Hamilton, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, John Adams was the Vice President, and Thomas Jefferson was the Secretary of State, they got into a lot of arguments. There were a lot of screaming matches between them in the Oval Office, or I guess the Oval Office didn't exist then, but in the meetings with the president. And these divisions kind of created the first political parties under the Constitution. And those political parties were the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Democratic Republicans were often just called Republicans for short, but that is not the same thing as a modern-day Republican. The modern-day Republican Party wasn't invented until the mid-1800s, but they came out of the old anti-Federalist group that was against the Constitution. But now that the Constitution was agreed to, the Democratic Republicans were very much trying to restrict how much power the national or central government or the federal government had. And their leaders were Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And on the Federalist side, the leading figures in that political party were Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. So I'm just going to go through each of the different parties' beliefs and what they stood for. So I'm going to start with the Federalists. Their constituents, those people that supported the Federalists, were the manufacturers, the merchants, wealthy, educated people, the coastal cities. That's where they got their kind of voting base from. And their idea for government was that the government should be strong over the states. You should loosely interpret the Constitution. You don't got to be too strict about it. They wanted the wealthy and educated involved, limits on freedom of speech and press. They preferred a government that was similar to a king, that was able to get things done. They wanted a strong executive. For their domestic policy, they supported a national bank. They supported an excise tax, that is the tax on goods going out of a country. National debt was good for a country, they thought, because it would actually build up credit. So when you get money loaned to you and you pay it back, it actually increases the amount that countries would want to loan it to you in the future. National government would assume the state's debts. That would make sure that the federal government was getting more power. Tariffs should be high to try to encourage more production inside the country. So a tariff is a tax on something coming into the country. And in that case, they thought that, okay, if we tax more stuff being sold by foreigners coming into America, it'll encourage people to buy American and help American businesses. And now in their foreign policy, they were against the French Revolution. They wanted war with the French, favored the British. And we'll look at those last 2 things in more detail in a second. Now the Democratic Republicans, called Republicans for short, their constituents, their voting base were the farmers and planters. They were the party of the common man. They favored the South and West. So that's where you find most of their support in the South and West of the country. Their ideas for government was that they believed in states' rights over the national government. They believed the Constitution should be interpreted very strictly, that the government should never do anything that isn't explicitly said in detail in the Constitution. They believed that the common man should participate in government but be educated as well. Bill of Rights is sacred. You never violate them. That was one of the things they believed in. And they thought that it was better for the country if there was less government used. Against the national bank, against an excise tax, against the national debt. They always wanted a balanced checkbook. They wanted the states to pay their own debts to give more power and control to the states. And tariffs should be low because they wanted to support trade with other countries as well. They supported the French Revolution, opposed war with the French, and favored the French. So pretty clear opposites on some of these issues. Now, to get it more specific, the Federalists, they believed it was necessary on the issue of the national bank to make money, for a country to make money and pay off its debt. It doesn't matter which section of the country benefits from their point of view. They think the national bank is constitutional because it can be assumed that the government needs something like it to collect taxes. After all, the Constitution doesn't say how to collect taxes, and it should be up to the government to decide how that is actually done. The Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, they were afraid that the South would be left out of the economy because the banking interests, business, trade, manufacturing, they're all in the North. And they think the national bank is unconstitutional because the government isn't specifically given the power to create one. So this already shows you in one of the first issues of the first presidential administration how they had this debate over whether or not to make a national bank. And the other main issue they had disagreements on was what was going on between France and Britain. So from the Federalist point of view, it's in America's best interest to support Britain. Britain was America's biggest trading partner, and if they lose Britain as a trading partner, it would hurt the economy. They also argued that the treaty the U.S. made with France was made with King Louis XVI, and the revolutionaries in France killed the king, so we don't need to obey the treaty anymore. Plus, they thought the revolutionaries were being extremely violent, and they shouldn't support that kind of violence in another country. That was the Federalist point of view. On the other hand, the Democratic Republicans thought that America should support democracies or democratic revolutions against monarchies all the time. All revolutions are violent, they said, so we shouldn't worry so much about the violence in the French Revolution as long as it comes out to a happy ending. America, they said, owes France for helping in the Revolutionary War, so they should honor the treaty and help them and help out now. It was very much just honoring your agreement, that the agreement they believe was made with the French people, and it should be seen as being owed to the French people, not just any king or government. So that's what the divisions they had on those two main issues. Now we're going to get into the Adams administration. We're going to see the differences play out. So for the Adams administration, you have this slideshow, but I'm going to go over and narrate it now on the show in case you want to listen to it. So the Adams administration, here we have President John Adams, not the most photogenic of our presidents. He really needs a hairstylist. Election of 1796. So the elections of 1796 was unique because it was the first time we actually had an election with like an actual competition with political parties. So we had a Federalist candidate, John Adams, versus a Democratic Republican candidate, Thomas Jefferson. And John Adams narrowly won the election against Jefferson. Adams was the vice president, so he had an edge from that perspective. Jefferson was the Secretary of State, but Adams was, as the successor to Washington, was kind of given the nod. And since this is before the 12th Amendment, Thomas Jefferson was the vice president because he came in second place. And here we have the vote totals. And you can already see how the differences in political parties actually show themselves on a map. The East Coast, most of the coastal area is covered by the Federalists, except for some areas down by Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. Out west, that's where the Democratic Republicans, south and west, have their supporters, and the Federalists are up north and on the coast. So the country is very geographically divided, even this early on. And you can see how close the election was. 3 electoral votes separated them. And the popular vote, even though it doesn't really matter, also close as well. And the territories are places that have not been made into states yet. So these are the problems that are facing President Adams at this point. So America was divided over whether to support France or Britain, or remain neutral, in their ongoing war. So France and Britain had been at war again since 1792. The second big thing that was facing President Adams, America's relationship with France was terrible, coming close to actually having a war with the USA itself. 3, there was huge division in America between political parties, Federalists versus Democratic Republicans. President Adams was a Federalist, his vice president Thomas Jefferson was a Democratic Republican, and they didn't get along at all. They used to be best friends, at this point not so much. And the fourth problem facing President Adams, division between the parties led to conflicts between states and the federal government. So let's look at Adams' foreign policy first. The XYZ affair was the big news story that was facing the Adams administration. So at this point, America's relationship with France was terrible because America refused to help France in its war and repay its debts, owed to King Louis XVI, who was killed. As a result, President Adams' first priority was to deal with this crisis. So in 1797, President Adams sent a 3-person mission to improve relations with France. But when the Americans got to France, they were not welcomed as they expected. So remember, it's in purple, you take notes on it, you abbreviate. So a way to abbreviate this note might be 1797-Adams sends mission to improve relationship with France. Easy way to make it shorter. So the 3 French diplomats who represented the French government refused to meet with Americans unless they were given $250,000 in bribe money, and France was loaned millions of dollars. So obviously the American diplomats refused this craziness. It was insulting to them to be asked for bribe money and a loan just to meet with the French government. But when news of this got out, the American public got angry, and many people, especially the Federalists, demanded war with France. And on the right, you have a political cartoon of the whole thing breaking out. You have the guillotine in the background, and you have the French government represented by like this 5-headed monster guy with a dagger. And when Adams broke the news to the nation, he kept the French diplomats' names anonymous, and he replaced their names with the letters X, Y, and Z. And that's why this is called the XYZ affair. They just wanted to keep them anonymous so they didn't have like outrage pouring at certain individuals. And this leads into the next major issue in the Adams presidency, the Quasiwar with France. So tensions rose between France and the U.S. before and after the XYZ affair. France was angry with America after signing the Jay Treaty with Britain, and they responded by seizing American ships. So they would shoot at American ships on the ocean and take them over. The tension reached a climax in 1798 as France and America fought each other in an undeclared naval war from 1798 to 1800. We call it the Quasi-War because the word quasi means so-called or sort of. So we named it the Quasi-War because it wasn't officially a war declared by Congress, but there was still unofficial war stuff going on. So kind of sad, America and French relations going pretty sour right after being allied with each other in the Revolutionary War. And here we have a painting of one of those conflicts on the ocean. And the Quasi-War with France. Despite his preference for Britain over France, President Adams desperately wanted to keep America out of war, even though members of his own Federalist Party, Alexander Hamilton especially, wanted to ally with Britain against France. So to keep America neutral, Adams sent another mission to France and reached an agreement with Napoleon for France to stop seizing American ships. War was avoided, but Federalists were unhappy. So Adams, even though he was a Federalist, he still wanted to keep with the tradition Washington set. He wanted to stay neutral, and he tried to keep America neutral, and he eventually did. Now this turns to our domestic policy for Adams. His entire presidency was dominated by all this conflict with France and Britain, and it actually had an impact at home as well. So while all the drama was going on overseas, the tensions were felt between America and France at home too, namely in the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Federalists feared that the French immigrants that were coming to America would actually be disloyal to America and support France, so they enacted laws against these French immigrants and their political opponents, the Democratic Republicans. The laws passed were called the Alien and Sedition Acts. And here on the right I have a political cartoon showing sedition bills as kind of this gigantic snake threatening freedoms protected by the First Amendment. What were these laws exactly, and what did they do? Well, here's what they did. So the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Alien Act passed in 1798, they increased the years needed to live in the U.S. for citizenship from 5 years to 14 years because they wanted fewer French people becoming citizens, and it allowed the president to deport or imprison any alien he considered dangerous. And as a note, alien in this sense just means any foreign resident who is not a citizen. It does not mean the Area 51 kind of alien. And the Sedition Act, also passed in 1798, made it a crime to say anything false or insulting about the government and was used to target Republicans. If you're wondering if that's violating the First Amendment, yeah, pretty basically, yeah, it's violating the First Amendment. And we'll see how that kind of gets done away with later on. But here I have this meme, some guy in 1798, hey, I'm not too sure about this new Alien and Sedition Act, John Adams, keeping the mouth or beak shut. So this is how Adams tried to deal with the conflict at home in the United States. And this spilled over into a fight between the federal government and the state government. And we have the other issue that happened for Adams within the United States was the states' rights debate, Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. So the Republicans were very angry with the Alien and Sedition Acts. They thought the Sedition Act violated the Constitution, violating the First Amendment, as you can imagine. And Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, they organized resistance to these acts by drafting the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which said that states could ignore the laws because they judged them to be unconstitutional. So from their point of view, the Sedition Act was violating the First Amendment, so a state doesn't have to obey it. This is a controversial idea because some said the federal government had the final say, and they would have to wait for the Supreme Court to make a ruling, while others said the states as members of the nation were the ones who really had the power to say no. And at this point, remember, Jefferson is the vice president. So you have the vice president going against the president. And the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions opened a big debate about states' rights and whether or not a state could refuse to obey federal laws. And the fact that the vice president went behind the sitting president's back to help write these resolutions opposing the president's wishes just made the relationship between Adams and Jefferson worse. And this and other disagreements they had led to Jefferson running against Adams again in the election of 1800. So it's our first presidential rematch. They ran against each other in 1796, and they're going to run against each other again in the election of 1800, which is going to be even more vicious. So you have president versus vice president. So Adams, the last part of your notes is going to have you grade President Adams. So based on what you learned from this slideshow and what your own opinions are, I'm asking you, how do you think John Adams should be remembered? The last section on the notes tasks you with giving John Adams a letter grade for his job as president. Is he an A+ president, an F president, something in between? You decide and explain at the bottom of the notes. And here we have this famous book that was used as the basic information for the HBO series John Adams. We watched a clip from that from the Boston Massacre episode. But John Adams, kind of a controversial president, seen as kind of going against the Constitution, but also being put in a tough spot. What do you think? What grade does he deserve? Let me know. And that is it for Adams today. And I'm going to go back to our Free LEPRE Radio slideshow for our final segment of the day, Criminal Animals. The crime never stops, even under quarantine. And our first culprit, the seagull community. The beaches are empty. That's because the seagulls have taken over. So seagull attack victim says it's only a matter of time before they kill someone. They are a menace from the sky, dive bombing to steal food, attack children, and even kill pets. Thousands of people report being victims of vicious gulls each week, and the problem is so common, town councils are appointing SGCOs, Specialist Goal Control Officers. If any of you are looking for summer work, Specialist Goal and Control Officer might be a job for you, keeping these seagulls under control, keeping us safe from their vicious attacks. Now, number 2, knife-wielding swan detained in London after standoff with police. We've seen this swan before. Peace was never an option, brandishing a knife in someone's local kitchen. Later that day, this swan has been detained by the police, brought to justice. I'm very happy and relieved that this criminal is taken off the streets, and so should you. Story number 3. Area pigeon kidnaps puppy for ransom of 1,200 breadcrumbs. Pigeons are getting desperate out there. The park goers are in small supply these days, being stuck indoors. They're not getting their bread. So this pigeon has kidnapped a puppy chihuahua, held it for ransom for 1,200 breadcrumbs. Let's see what happens. I hope for this pup's safe return. But that is Criminal Animals in the news for you this week. And that'll do it for this episode of Free LEPRE Radio. I tried to keep it under 20 minutes. Hopefully I succeeded. Thank you, goodbye, and I'll see you tomorrow.